Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about some wonderful books I have lately read from the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list. So I have been reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list and shortlist this year, as I do every year. I've now read everything from the shortlist, and I have read 9 out of the 12 books from the long list. There's one more that I'm hoping to read, but I don't think I'll get it read before the winner is announced, so I thought I would make my kind of final review video here, talking about the last 3 books on the long list that I want to speak to you about, 2 of which are on the shortlist, 1 of which isn't, and then giving you my general thoughts on the shortlist. So the 3 books I'm going to be reviewing for you today are Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremaine, Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson, and In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas, of which In the Upper Country and Absolutely and Forever are on the shortlist, and Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson is not, but was from the long list. This was my favourite of these 3, so I'm sad that it wasn't on the shortlist, but I am really glad that I read it. So let me talk about these books, and I'll go in kind of reverse order of preference, I guess, and I'll start with Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremaine, which I did really like, I should say. I just think I like the other 2 more. It was really interesting to read Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremaine because I've read one book by Rose Tremaine before, the Gustav Sonata, which I read years ago, and I didn't really get along with. I think it was just a bit too literary for me. My general taste is a bit more kind of reading group commercial, and sometimes if I read sort of proper literary fiction, it's just a bit too literary for me, a bit too thematic when I want plot, or it's not as focused as I want, or the ending's a bit too open, or that kind of thing. But because I knew that the Gustav Sonata wasn't really for me, I was a bit wary about picking up Absolutely and Forever, but actually I really like this one. My library copy is quite shiny, so I'm gonna put it down, but I found Absolutely and Forever very interesting. It's an interesting one to think about for the Walter Scott Prize, because it only just sneaks into the Walter Scott Prize's criteria. A book has to be set 60 years in the past, and this one is just set 60 years in the past, being set in the very late 50s and the very early 60s. And it's a kind of coming of age story of a girl called Marianne who, at the beginning of the book, when she is a teenager, falls desperately in love with a boy called Simon. She is absolutely passionately in love with him. And when this book looks at kind of Marianne's sort of obsessive love for Simon, her belief that she will love him absolutely and forever, and then we follow Marianne over many years of her life, and see kind of what comes of this. I found this book really interesting for lots of reasons. It is very short, and as I said, it spans a number of years. In a way, I feel like it's one of those novels that is almost like a short story. It's definitely longer than a short story, but I feel like in concept it is quite focused and a bit sort of pulled back, moving through Marianne's years and emotions in this sort of detached way that I actually felt really worked in this short form. And I do actually find that I often get on with shorter literary fiction more than longer literary fiction, but I found this a really interesting novel and character study. And I feel like it's hard for me to explain what I liked about it, because actually I feel like all the way through I was feeling mediumly about it and quite enjoying it, but I didn't love it. And then there's one thing that happens near the end, or that changes near the end, that has an impact on your reading of the earlier parts of the novel, and I really loved that one thing. I thought it was really clever and well done, and that really upped the book in my estimation and really worked very well for me. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I say it's like a short story, because I feel like in the same way that a short story kind of relies on one moment to tell you how to read and think about the whole thing, I feel like Absolutely and Forever is one of those novels that's like that, and I found that kind of element of the ending really interesting. I will say that it is very much a story about upper middle class, upper class people in the 1950s and 1960s, and while I absolutely love reading about upper middle class and upper class people in the Victorian period, I don't find reading about upper class people in the 60s quite as interesting. And there were a few times where I kind of got frustrated with sort of the general feel of privilege and unawareness that is present in a lot of the characters. I do feel like that is the point, and I do feel like maybe you're meant to be getting frustrated, and I feel like especially Marianne is quite spoiled and naive, and I feel that is kind of important, and she is learning things about herself and the world as we go through this book, and I do feel like that was done well, but I also feel like it does make it a slightly frustrating read at times. So overall, I did really enjoy Absolutely and Forever, and like I said, I think it does some really clever things towards the end of the novel. It wasn't my favourite from the long list. I'll talk a bit later on in the video about what books from the long list I would put on the shortlist, and this probably wouldn't be one of them, but I do think it is worth a read, and especially if your taste is a bit more literary than mine, then and I think you'll really enjoy it. So I'm glad I read it, and it was an interesting read. Next, I want to talk about In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas. So In the Upper Country is a really interesting historical novel set in 19th century Canada. It's set in the fictional town of Dunmore, a town in Canada that is almost exclusively occupied by people of colour, and it takes in a lot of runaway people who are fleeing slavery in the US and helps them kind of find a life in Canada. We're following a young woman called Cinder. She is very unusual in Dunmore because while most people come south to Dunmore, she has come from the north, from further north in Canada. We don't know why exactly she has come to Dunmore, but she's living there and kind of working partly as a secretary and partly as a journalist. And at the beginning of the novel, she ends up getting caught in a series of events where an older woman who has recently arrived in Dunmore with a group of other people who are all fleeing from the US is found and met by a bounty hunter, a man who has been employed to catch people who have escaped slavery. This elderly woman shoots and kills him, and while she is in the courthouse awaiting trial, Cinder goes to see her and ends up kind of trading stories with her, some of which are about her own life, some of which are stories she's heard. And the other woman tells Cinder stories of her own life too. And one of the things I really liked about The Upper Country is that it is a novel that is sort of made up of a lot of different stories. And some of the stories sort of just stand on their own. Some of the stories you'll see connections with other stories and with the kind of frame narrative later. But all these stories kind of like weave together to create a very complex tapestry and a really interesting story of these two women and of Black and Indigenous history in North America in the 19th century. And one of the things I thought was so interesting in The Upper Country was the way that it looked at both the depictions of Black people but also of Indigenous people in the 19th century in North America, and also how their lives might have intersected, how Indigenous people had a role in the Underground Railroad and things like that. And I just thought that was a really fantastic element of this book. I was reading the author's notes after I finished the novel, and he said something really interesting about kind of his inspiration behind this book that I wanted to read out because I found this really interesting and I feel like it's something he did really well. I was steeped in stories of various colonial formations. I knew and had seen many stories that were concerned with the relationships between Black and white people, and similarly between Indigenous and white people, and of course between whites and any other people of colour. But I couldn't think of a single story I knew that meaningfully explored Black and Indigenous relationships. And he goes on to talk about his research. I read and heard the stories of countless Black people who held remarkable knowledge of the land they inhabited and who had deep and complex relationships not only with the whites but also the Indigenous people around them. It became clear that the history was written and alive in ways that I was encountering and even experiencing. What I was missing, I realised, was the stories in narrative form. With a burgeoning passion for creative writing, I set out to write a novel. And I feel like that aim was really achieved, both in the way that this novel is a tapestry of lots of different stories and lots of different voices, but also in the way that this novel looks at the relationships between Black and Indigenous people in North America in the 19th century in a really, really interesting and powerful way. I also feel like the characterization was great. I really enjoyed the conversations between Cinder and the older woman. I felt like their characterization was done so well, and also the other characters around Cinder, like the other people who live in the town of Dunmore. You get such a good sense of their characters, even if they're not in the narrative for that long. It is a tough and emotional read, but it is done so well, and I really, really recommend it. I will say that I think In the Upper Country is also like slightly at the literary end of my taste, and I feel like I would have liked another like 4 chapters at the end of the novel. I do feel like that's very much a personal taste thing where I like my endings to have a bit more closure, and I do think that is a kind of literary versus less literary divide a lot of the time. A lot of literary fiction ends in a more ambiguous way, and I do kind of get why this novel had to end where it did, but also I kind of wanted another 5 chapters, and I kind of wish it was longer. However, I do think it was really fantastic, and I also feel like it was really nice to read the author's notes after having read the novel, because I feel like I just got a great sense that Kai Thomas really achieved what he wanted to achieve, and I just thought it was really, really good. So definitely recommend The Upper Country, really interesting novel. So those 2 books made the shortlist, and then I read one other book that had made the long list but not the shortlist, and that was Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson, which I really, really loved. I thought this was a great, really interesting historical novel. This one is set chiefly in 19th century Scotland and looks at the Highland clearances. Again, my library copy is a bit reflective, so I'm gonna take that down. So this novel is kind of told in a variety of parts, and it sort of moves backwards and forwards in time. We have a few different kind of timelines going on. In July 18 1884, we meet a relatively newly married middle-aged couple and get to see their sort of new burgeoning relationship, where they're both kind of like still puzzling each other out. We then go back to the previous autumn 1883, where the man showed up on the woman's doorstep looking for lodgings, and she recognised him immediately from somewhere in their past, but he didn't recognise her. And then we end up through memories and letters and flashbacks, moving back to the 1840s, back to the Highland clearances, when Jamesina Ross, the woman we meet in 1884, and her family and many other people of Celtic origin were forcibly removed from their homes and their villages, where the people had lived for a very, very long time in the Scottish Highlands, and moved out of that land and further south in Scotland to make room for sheep pastures and other things that the upper classes wanted to use that land for. The Highland clearances are not something I knew very much about before reading this book, and I found it really, really interesting to learn more about it while reading this novel. I feel like that was explored so well. I feel like there was so much in Music in the Dark that I loved. It's a really, really interesting novel, and it very interestingly pieces together the story through lots of different moments in time, lots of flashbacks, lots of like letters and articles and other sources. We see things both from Jamesina's and her new husband's perspectives, and we get all these different moments of these two lives that come together to make a story that you don't really fully understand and know about until much further on in the novel, and I feel like that just worked really well. I also feel like there are a lot of wonderfully explored themes in this novel, things about marriage and gender and equality, themes about class and prejudice, and the treatment of people without power by those with power, themes about music and writing, and the power of poetry and song. Jamesina, as a child and a young woman, used to write music in Gaelic, and she used to want to write songs to tell the stories of her people and of the Highland clearances, but she has kind of let those things drift away from her in the intervening years, but the songs kind of still remain. There is a sense of music in the dark, you know, of music bringing hope in bad times, which I feel is so interesting in this novel. Memory is also a really, really important theme in this book. How we remember things from the past, how that affects us, collective memory and individual memory, and this book kind of looks at memory in lots of different ways that I found really, really interesting. And I also feel like the characterization and the kind of backstories of the characters were really, really complicated. I feel like it would have been really easy to make it so that there was only kind of one particular like traumatic event in the two characters' pasts, but there have been a lot of different kinds of hardship and kinds of sadness in both of their lives, and I feel like that was explored really, really well. At its heart, Music in the Dark is a love story, and it's a really interesting love story because you know from the beginning that Jamesina and her lodger get married. You know that they are married, but you flash back and see how it's come to that point, and also how their marriage goes on. The love story between these two people who are both a bit older, finding love later on in life, have both like had a really rubbish time of life. I feel like that love story is so good and so moving and so powerful, and I just loved it. So I really, really enjoyed Music in the Dark. I thought it was a fantastic novel. I'm very sad that it didn't make the shortlist, but I really did think it was great. So before I finish up, I did want to talk about the shortlist in general. I've now read 9 out of 12 books from the long list, and I've read all 6 books on the shortlist. So the shortlist for the Walter Scott Prize this year consists of The New Life by Tom Crewe, Hungry Ghost by Kevin Jarrett Hussein, My Father's House by Joseph O'Connor, In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas, Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremaine, and The House of Doors by Tam Twang Eng. Of that shortlist, my favourite to win is The New Life by Tom Crewe, which I thought was fantastic. I really, really loved it, and I would be very happy to see it win the Walter Scott Prize. I think I would also be pretty happy if Hungry Ghost won, because I thought that was also fantastic, and that's also one that has stayed with me quite a lot and that I've been thinking about quite a lot since. If I were, however, to make my own personal shortlist from the long list, it would consist of quite a few things that are not on the long list. I would say that the 3 books I've read from the long list that didn't make the shortlist, all of them would be on my personal shortlist, and I'm really sad that none of them made the shortlist, especially Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, which for me is the standout from the long list by like a really, really long way. I thought Cuddy was incredible, possibly my favourite book I've read this year. Amazing exploration of history, amazingly moving, powerful novel, wonderful characterization, wonderful use of form, really inventive and original as well. And I just thought Cuddy was fantastic, and I'm still not over the fact that Cuddy didn't make the shortlist, because I think Cuddy should win. If I were to make my own personal shortlist from the 9 books that I've read on the long list, Cuddy by Benjamin Myers would absolutely be at the top of that. The New Life by Tom Crewe would also be on there, as would Hungry Ghosts by Kevin Jarrett Hussein, and then I would put on it For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie, and Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson. And then I don't know for my 6th place on my own personal shortlist whether I would have My Father's House by Joseph O'Connor or In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas. Basically because I feel like as a reading experience, I probably actually slightly enjoyed My Father's House by Joseph O'Connor more. But I feel like In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas is probably the better book. Like, I feel like that's the book that does more interesting things. I felt like the pacing at the end of My Father's House was a little bit off and a little bit slow. And like, I feel like My Father's House was a really great book and a really enjoyable reading experience, but I feel like it was a bit flawed. Whereas I feel like In the Upper Country was like perfect for what it was trying to do. I just would have liked a little bit more at the end because I am a bit less of a literary person. But that's quite interesting actually, that I felt like the ending of My Father's House was too long and I felt like the ending of In the Upper Country was a bit too short. But I think that's very much a personal preference thing. And I did think both of them were great. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the last 3 books I've read for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. Those are my thoughts on the shortlist. We will see what the winner is. Please do let me know down in the comments your thoughts on any of these books. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.